Hey there, I just wanted to mention real fast that if you wanted to maybe skip around the individual game recommendations, then you can use the YouTube chapters to do that. But yeah, that's it. Go ahead and enjoy the video. The multiplayer genre is a pretty unique thing, I think. To me, it's a lot more than just a genre. You could argue that it's more of a mechanic in and of itself. But maybe more importantly, to play a multiplayer game means that you can have unique opportunities playing with your friends, things you wouldn't be able to do by just playing alone. But in all my time playing games, I come across these weird hiccups where I just can't find anything to play. You probably clicked on this video because you're having the same issue. That or you're bored, which is also fair. But today I'd like to throw my hat into the ring for video game recommendations I have that you can play with you and a couple other people. My unique spin on this video, if you want to call it that, is that I'm not necessarily going to have any hard prerequisites necessarily. We're going to be covering games of every genre, every budget, every platform, any number of players. The only real requirement is that it's multiplayer and that you can play it currently. My hope for making the video like this is that we can reach into some pretty weird places and come up with some hopefully pretty unique ideas for what you can play. So yeah, some picks here are going to be kind of weird, but hopefully it's a good thing. But yeah, without any more dawdling, let's go ahead and get started. So I personally believe that Remnant 2 is not only a strong start to the video, but also one that's going to be kind of hard to describe, but I'll give it a shot. Remnant 2 is a third-person shooter Souls-like, with some roguelite elements here or there, which sounds like a lot, and that's because it is. Remnant 2 takes place in a post-apocalyptic version of Earth. Within the first hour of gameplay, your custom-created character finds this weird crystal, which will take them to one of four, sorta parallel dimensions for you to explore. Along your path exploring any world will net you new equipment and different bosses to defeat. Where you go and what you face are not determined by you, and are instead pre-generated whenever you start the game. Locations, equipment, enemies, and bosses are all preset by the game, meaning that in theory, every time you or your friend try to pick up the game, there's something sort of new and different to expect. This game is pretty big on build crafting and build variety. Both the strengths and weaknesses of you and your teammates are all things that the game kind of has a huge focus on. Someone being the dedicated healer, or the unkillable tank, are all going to be things that define you uniquely as a player. Even so much as the class system is very non-uniform. You start the game picking out one class, or archetype as this game calls them, and pretty early on you get to mix it with a different archetype, further defining your individual playstyle. If you want to be absolutely unstoppable with a huge amount of health, then you can be a tank with the healer class and do just that. Alternatively, if you're a character that does a lot of damage from very far ranges, with something like a bow or a sniper rifle, then you can also mix it with the summoner to make it to where your summons take the heat from you, and really any just combination of things, even stuff I haven't mentioned. There is a lot to look forward to in this game, and I think especially in a multiplayer setting it could be really cool to see what your friends pick. But I will say, as something of a forewarning, it's kind of a fool's errand to expect any one piece of equipment in this game. The procedural generation nature of Remnant means that if you want something in specific, you need to really grind for it, and in some cases this can be absolutely annoying. Just probably the worst drag you can imagine. And for that reason, my best recommendation, especially as a new player, is don't expect anything. Just be surprised at what you come across. And if it fits roughly how you want to play, then go ahead and use it. I'm a big fan of both of the Remnant games. My first sort of video essay that I ever made basically talked about how people should be playing the first game because the sequel is coming out. And now that it's here, there's nothing stopping me from saying that Remnant 2 is a straight upgrade from Remnant 1, which immediately leads into me speaking about how Remnant 1 can largely be skipped, simply because the only thing you're missing there is like a handful of equipment pieces that didn't make their way into Remnant 2. But I really don't think you're missing much there. It's not like the narratives in these games are all that strong of a focus, so you can play the second game immediately and be just fine. Before we move on, I do want to say that there are two $10 DLC for Remnant that I have not played yet, so I can't necessarily vouch for their quality in any way, but at some point I do plan to play them. For what it's worth though, the base game is plenty of video game, especially if you end up liking it enough to play it for a long time. Collecting more things and further refining your build by just going out and experiencing more of what the game has to offer is a pretty good gameplay cycle in my opinion. And I'd say it justifies the $50 price tag. So yeah, Terraria seems like a pretty obvious pick, but there's kind of a criminally high amount of people that aren't aware of this game's modding scene. Terraria is a 2D, survival sandbox game. What sets Terraria apart specifically, though, is that very quickly as you're playing it, the survival aspects of the game get kinda shifted away, and instead, Terraria focuses a lot more on its bosses and progression, and I guess just its combat in general. I don't think it's hyperbole whenever I say that Terraria is one of the survival games. Not only is it a full game that's been fully released, but it's constantly seeing updates. Never once has the developers of the game ever even thought about abandoning it. They thought about finishing it at one point, you know, just stopping development, saying that it's good enough as is, but then they just kept making stuff for it. Now, yeah, obviously, if you've already played Terraria, then you've played it, and there might not be much to write home about necessarily if you're looking to find something new to play. That is, of course, if you're not talking about the modding scene for Terraria, which, if you ask me, is sort of criminally underrated. There are at least 4 or 5 full conversion mods for Terraria that basically act like full-length DLCs for the game. They not only end up adding more post-game stuff, but also more mid-game and early-game stuff for you to look forward to. And I think in this way, especially if you haven't played the game for a long time, it might be worthwhile to check out some of these mods. The footage here is of the Calamity mod, which is pretty much the de facto Terraria mod, just in terms of how much is going on in it. The quality of this mod specifically really does make me think that it should just be a part of the base game already, although it does sort of deviate from a lot of Terraria's other aspects, but only in the sort of good creative liberties kind of way. Like, I don't know. This mod is so popular that odds are you've heard some of its music before, because that's just how good it is. If you've played Terraria, then you also understand what I'm talking about whenever I say that the game shifts away from its survival mechanics, and in its place being the combat. You understand that your character not only gets to do more damage, but also has more freedom of movement. Being able to literally fly is sort of a prerequisite in the game anyway, before you can face some of the harder enemies. And specifically within regards to the Calamity mod, this is sort of exemplified. Basically, everything just gets turned up to 11, and things never stop getting crazier and crazier up until you finally beat the last boss. And I think purely from a chaotic nature standpoint, that's kind of a whole thing. Like, I don't know. It's at least something that deserves your attention, I feel. Because if nothing else, I do believe that Terraria is a game worth playing for its mods. The base game is fine, it's perfectly serviceable, and it's honestly pretty good on its own. I sunk a lot of hours into it, especially whenever I was younger. But I don't know, Calamity mods just kind of peaked Terraria in its own weird way. Yeah, that's right, I'm talking about Magicka again. Make no mistake, I will find each and every opportunity to talk about this game when given the chance. So, Magicka 2 is best described as a twin-stick top-down shooter. But that description doesn't necessarily do it justice. Magicka's sort of flagship mechanic is its spellcrafting system. I'm gonna try really hard not to sound like a broken record here, considering that I already made a video on Magicka. Basically, players have access to 8 elements that they can choose from. They can largely mix these elements in any order to create unique spells for the sake of combat. Elements combined together also keep their traits from whatever they're kind of supposed to do. Fire dries stuff off, cold will freeze things, heal will restore your health, and stuff like that. There are some elements that can't mix, like water and lightning for example, but you'll kind of just have to figure those out as you go along, because that's kind of part of the fun of it. Just with what I've mentioned already, you can kind of see how this game can be kind of super chaotic and messy. And that's where a lot of the humor and enjoyment from it kind of comes from. Especially team killing, that happens a lot. Whatever spacebar does. I have no idea what spacebar does. Those are heal bombs.
Are you fucking I haven't even been using them right.
But yeah, you also get the ability to cast your chosen spell in any way that you want to. Your options can include things like a projectile, imbuements on your sword, self-cast and AoE cast, and a whole bunch of other stuff too. And sort of just figuring out how all this stuff works can be a lot of fun. Let me put it this way. The first unique spell that you unlock in like the first mission of the game is the revive spell to resurrect teammates. The game's not particularly long, but I kind of feel like it doesn't need to be necessarily. The spellcrafting aspect of the game doesn't necessarily overstay its welcome, and for the price tag you can't necessarily go wrong either. If you want to go through the game again, you have incentive to do so through harder difficulties. Completing harder difficulties will unlock you more things that you can customize your character with. All of these will end up changing your stats and how your elements will perform, as well as just being able to find stuff by going off the beaten path. The only other thing that I'll kind of bring up is that the game's actual humor in terms of writing is maybe a little bit dated. Not like offensively dated, I don't think. It's just kind of, I don't know, old. There's a lot of old meme culture in here. and that can be kind of bleh, but you know. I will say if you want to know more about this game specifically, then you can check out my previous video where I largely talk about Magicka 2 and its relation with Arrowhead, who, if you didn't know, made Helldivers. One other thing I'll bring up too, just in case you don't watch that video, both in that one and in this one here, I mention how it's not exactly a good idea to play the first game just because it doesn't work on most PCs. So I think it bears repeating just to say it again, probably don't bother with buying the first game because it might not just work with your rig at all. But the second game works perfectly fine, so just stick with that one if you're interested. History has not looked fondly on Resident Evil 5. Back in 2009, this game was seen as one of the worst Resident Evil games, and only really as of recently have people changed their tone about it. Probably, I guess, because people figured out that playing it multiplayer is way better than playing it single player. I don't know why it took them over a decade to figure that out, but anyway, here we are. Resident Evil 5 is pretty good. I think especially if you've played OG Resident Evil 4 and haven't given this game a shot, and you happen to quite like Resident Evil 4, then I'm willing to say that you'll be pretty familiar with this game. It's going to feel pretty much the same, just you have another player with you now. Well, that, and then also this is more of a action-heavy Resident Evil game as opposed to a survival-heavy one, which, since OG RE4 has been kind of leaning into that angle anyway. If you've been following these games' timeline, then you know that already, so I'm not going to reiterate it. And if nothing else, if you're not a fan of Resident Evil in any way in the slightest, then bottom line, this is just a really good third-person multiplayer shooter. The game's relatively short, you have multiple options for weapons within the same category of weapon, different shotguns, different rifles, different pistols, stuff like that. It's a Capcom game, so replayability is kind of warranted, post-game unlocks and all that good stuff, and there's a handful of pretty cheap DLC, all of which are kind of, sort of mini-games in their own right. One cool thing I should mention about Resident Evil 5, with regards to its multiplayer specifically, is that as far as I know, every version of the game is not only online play, but also couch co-op as well. So if you happen to have somebody near you, then you can only pay the $120 fee to play the game, and occupy a weekend to go through the game. I will mention though, that trying to play the game in the modern day, and connecting with a friend online, will end up having a little issue right out of the box. Basically, the game's connectivity features were based off of games for Windows Live, which doesn't work anymore. But there are plenty of simple guides online to circumvent this, and you can play the game completely scot-free. At least personally speaking, we didn't have any issues whenever we played, so make of that what you will, I guess. Yeah, that's right, we have something of a double feature here today. Resident Evil Revelations 2 is probably the least popular Resident Evil game as far as I know, and not necessarily for being infamous. I just kind of think it jumped past a lot of people's radars for whatever reason. This, I'd like to imagine, is likely due because you have to buy each chapter individually. It's an episodic story. You have to kind of buy each chapter as they were coming out back then, which could potentially end up costing a lot of money for a game that has about the same runtime as Resident Evil 5. And yeah, back then that would have been a pretty huge issue. However, the game now, in its entirety with all the DLC and all the chapters included, is only $20. For this reason and a whole bunch of other reasons, I kind of compare Revelations 2 to RE5 in a lot of ways. The biggest difference being kind of its core gameplay. I wouldn't necessarily call this a straight-up survival horror experience, but it is a lot more survival horror than action horror. I wouldn't say you're necessarily managing a whole lot of resources here. You're not going to be strapped for particularly any of your ammo necessarily, except for maybe magnum ammo. But compared to Resident Evil 5, instead of the second player being just as capable as the first player, the second player ends up having very little, if any, offensive means to protect themselves. And yeah, like, I don't know, man, I was pleasantly surprised by this game, all things considered. Like, just looking around for stuff to play, seeing if there was any more multiplayer Resident Evil games, and then, oh yeah, Revelations is a thing. Now, again, I know that you see Revelations 2 in the title, and I'm gonna tell you right now, I have not played Revelations 1. I don't know what that's about, and I don't even know if it's multiplayer. I think it might be, but I don't know. It's not like the narrative of these two games are all that important anyway, so I mean, you know, whatever. I will say though, as sort of a huge issue with this game, and the only primary barrier to entry, is that for this game specifically, it's only couch co-op. Asterisk. Because of the game being released on Steam, you can, in fact, use Steam Remote Play for the other player to control, in which case the only actual barrier to entry there is having a decent enough internet for the second player to connect to. I wish I had a more concrete number or answer to give you on how good your internet needs to be to get that to work consistently, but I just don't have one. But I will say, if you're willing to give it a shot, the game's here and it's good. It Takes Two is going to act as sort of the mascot for this video. If you've seen other videos like this one, then they've probably recommended It Takes Two to you and your friends. And I think, speaking personally from experience, I believe this game really does warrant every recommendation that it gets. The multiplayer nature of It Takes Two is so integral to its design that it's one of the only games on this list that you straight up can't play if you're not playing multiplayer. There are 0 single player options whatsoever. It Takes Two is a multiplayer puzzle platformer game. Everything from the puzzles to the platforming to even the combat have a multiplayer focus. I'd say in most instances of the game, you are going to have to rely on the other player to do their job. I really don't think there's a game that handles the camaraderie aspect better than this game specifically. Largely speaking, there isn't any progression in It Takes Two. Instead, each chapter or level or whatever you want to call it has a unique mechanic for both characters to use. Sometimes these will be different mechanics, and sometimes they just are mechanics that work best in a pair. One of the levels, for example, has a magnet that's split in 2, and you have to use the magnets to attract to each other or to environmental objects for platforming and puzzle solving. Just as an example. While normally I would argue in any other game that this is kind of lame, that basically none of the mechanics have any actual staying power, I think it goes without saying that it means that every mechanic doesn't outstay its welcome, and every level feels unique and fun to play all on its own for these different mechanics. There's a couple of levels that'll just switch the game genre on you. Like midway-ish into the game, there's literally like a dungeon crawling minigame in the middle of it that's a part of the level design itself, and it's really fun on its own too. It's kind of simple, but it's a cool way to break up the pace. Each environment you go through also has a very distinct look and feel to it too. Whole color palettes devoted just to each level that look really, really neat. The characters in the story are also something that's like roughly based out of a Pixar movie, just aged up a little bit, in terms of an arbitrary age rating, I guess. But arguably, the coolest thing about It Takes Two is that you only need to buy the game once. Only one player needs to own a copy of the game, and by downloading the quote-unquote demo for the game on the Steam page, you'll instead get the Friends Pass. The player who uses the Friend Pass is still allowed to play every single one of the levels. There's no content cut from them whatsoever. The other player just needs to have the full game. And if 2 players decide to use the Friends Pass, then they just get to play the first chapter completely for free. So you could even test the waters a little bit and see if you like the game by playing the whole first level. That's really, really cool. And I don't know if I have necessarily anything else to say for It Takes Two. It deserves every accolade that it can get, honestly. And yeah, I don't know. If you don't play anything else today, then maybe pick up this one. I honestly don't see how you could go wrong with it. Risk of Rain 2 is one of those games that needs very little introduction. If you missed it in its heyday, Risk of Rain 2 is the sequel to the very popular Risk of Rain 1. The popularity of 2 basically dwarfed the first game when it was introduced, and for good reason, I think. Both of the Risk of Rain games are tried and true roguelites, and probably some of the best of the genre. Pick a character of unique and varied gameplay style, collect items to bolster your stats and abilities, and then either make it to the end of the run or keep looping until you die. That description pretty much fits any roguelite of its kind, but I think specifically in regards to Risk of Rain 2, I think it really is the top of its class in terms of pure roguelite action. This is one of those games where if you keep collecting items, it'll just turn into utter chaos. Running around at Mach speed with 700 attack speed, flinging 900 different projectiles. And it's good fun. Bit of a highlight I do want to mention, the game has a pretty respectable modding scene. There's new content everywhere if you decide to mod it in. New characters, new items, new environments, and full conversions. the whole 9 yards. If you don't like something, you can take it out or change it, and 99% of the mods work pretty seamlessly in multiplayer, including a multiplayer mod to make it to where you can have more people in a server, which is great, and can also get pretty ridiculous. Right, so if you think this is the most out-of-pocket pick for this list, then you've seen nothing yet. So, Dying Light is a bit on the older side in terms of games on this list, and I understand that. But obviously I still think it warrants talking about. Dying Light is a movement-based looter game, set in the post-apocalypse, which I'm sure you can tell means that there's zombies everywhere. Movement in this movement game is done solely through use of the game's parkour mechanics. Which, if this is a new concept for you, then parkour is a lot of running on rooftops, climbing architecture, and all that other good stuff. That also means that despite this being technically a first-person shooter game, it has like platformer elements and stuff like that in it too. A lot of quests in this game are going to have you basically running through obstacle courses, either being timed or needing to find some sort of objective. And the environments and challenges can be pretty varied all across the board, which yeah, on its own is pretty cool. But I haven't even talked about the combat yet. So being that this is a zombie survival game, mechanics of this subgenre are kind of expected more or less. You got things like having the ability to find random weapons laying about. Sometimes they're in storage containers and these act like loot chests. Sometimes enemies will have stuff and other things like that. Different qualities of weapons act as different rarities or different grades of weapon. And on top of that, weapons are also moddable in the sort of post-apocalyptic kind of way. You've got things to look forward to in terms of progression as well though. Not only can you find new and different weapons, or just upgrades to weapons you previously had, like I mentioned before, but you also get access to things like a skill tree and stuff too, bolstering your combat capabilities and your movement capabilities. Some of these skills even splash into other mechanics of the game. Some of your combat skills can actually help you with the movement in some cases. There's a large part of me that believes that people kind of just forgot about Dying Light 1, and that's probably because this game came out during sort of the peak of everybody getting tired of the zombie survival shtick. But what's here is already surprisingly competent, and surprisingly deep too. And I think for the price point you can't go wrong with this choice either. I will say real fast too that Dying Light 2 is a thing, and I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but I just don't like Dying Light 2 as much as I like Dying Light 1. I don't know, something about it just wasn't fun for me, and I don't know if that's a common thing for people to say. But, I mean, if you feel like vouching for Dying Light 2, then go ahead. I don't know, not my cup of tea personally. But the first game's good. Now, I'm sure this game needs no introduction, but I guess I'm obligated to introduce it anyway. You know, as a treat. So, technically, Baldur's Gate 3 is a turn-based RPG, but that genre distinction really doesn't do it justice. If I'm allowed to be straightforward with it, it plays more similarly to like a digital version of a D&D campaign, complete with a laundry list of things your character is eventually able to do with their backgrounds and their progression and all that. Baldur's Gate 3 also won Game of the Year during 2023, to basically no competition, and I definitely think that it's a good enough game to warrant that. But in other news, did y'all know this game was multiplayer? I'd certainly say that you're forgiven if you didn't know, or rather that you probably forgot, because odds are this game took so much of your brain power to try to figure out how best to go about whatever situation or story beat that you probably completely forgot that multiplayer was a thing. But no, it's here and it works and it's good. There's absolutely no subtractions from making your campaign into a multiplayer one at all. If anything, you can kind of divide and conquer using the other player to let them do their own thing. If you're playing the game online, then basically as soon as you start, then both of you can make your own custom characters.
They run to no one.
Yeah. No, they're gonna run to a fucking pile of corpses is what they're gonna do. Lock.
Why do you want to unlock the bear?
It's like people. It's like the people on the cells when they're like got two hands on. They're like, "Let me out!"
Yeah, that's literally what. Eric Andre, let me in. Yeah, let me in. I'll take my chances with a fucking bear!
Holy shit.
Alternatively, if you wanted to stretch it, you could also play the game couch co-op if you wanted to. You would basically just need to do the hiring mechanic, make a custom character, and then have the other player control that one. I guess up until that point, they would control the other characters. Like the singular party members, the ones that are tied to their own stories and stuff. You know, the ones that the game made. I genuinely don't feel like I need to explain Baldur's Gate, like in any capacity. Honestly, if you haven't heard of this game, then you probably have actually been living under a rock. If you want like a review or something, or some other video essay talking about the game, then there are hundreds of other more qualified videos for that purpose alone. Just know that it's really good, it has a long playtime, and while the price point is high, there's a lot to look forward to here. So, yeah, I don't really know how to even start this segment if I'm being honest. So, I'm willing to bet that the long drive is probably the weirdest pick on here. It's basically a driving simulator. There's randomly generated elements with stuff that you come across, parts for your vehicle, new vehicles, stuff that you can find and equip, supplies, and all kinds of stuff. If you're wondering what you're looking at, that's pretty much by design. The game is janky, and the game wears the jank on its sleeve. Just one sleeve. The game makes itself out to be as goofy and comical as possible. And if you're looking for something just completely off the wall to play, then this is probably the go-to pick I would select for somebody else. It's also weirdly zen sometimes, too. So you know how, like, Desert Bus used to be a big thing, and you had this ridiculously long path, and sometimes you would just go in a Discord call or see somebody streaming it and just kind of hang out with them? Use it as an excuse to sort of just, I don't know, waste time talking with people? I think the long drive is kind of a weird, perfect evolution of that. Just the main difference being that there is stuff to do, as long as you go out of your way and do it. And in this way, it's still engaging, which is pretty cool. It's weirdly mechanically deep, too. Like, it's not complicated, but like, different vehicles will ask for different fuel types and stuff. Different vehicles of varying sizes means that you have different, like, cargo room to work with, as well as just maintenance on the vehicles in case you run into stuff. Or you get attacked, which also happens, there are enemies in this game. I don't think the long drive is like a sleeper hit or anything, but it's surprisingly good, weirdly enough. And I mean, if you want to go ahead and play the dumbest thing imaginable, then here it is. I'll also just mention, for the sake of elaborating, the average playtime simply said yes, and that's because the distance to get to the end of the game is infeasibly long. Like, there's no way you're getting to the end of the game. I also think this kind of just works to its benefit, though, because at the end of the day, if you get bored with it, you just don't have to play it anymore. You get as much playtime out of it as you're willing to put in, and you decide when it stops, because there's not like a storyline or anything. But yeah, I don't know, weird surprising pick, and I think it is worth a look. So real fast, I need to preface something before we actually get started with this part. Only as of recently am I actually going through the motions of playing Final Fantasy XIV, and only lately have I found myself with enough time to actually play an MMO for once. I've always had a passing interest in Final Fantasy XIV, and even for what little I've played thus far, I have to say that I am pretty pleasantly surprised. Final Fantasy XIV is one of the most respected and acclaimed MMOs of all time, and continues to be so. There's a constant influx of new content, and sometimes even new mechanics depending on, like, what dungeon you're doing, or a new expansion, sometimes even events. I'd like to say that whenever you're just starting out, it's pretty run-of-the-mill MMO stuff, which if you're looking for something completely new and fresh from the MMO scene, then maybe you're not necessarily going to find it here, at least not starting out. But take it from me personally, I'm not a particularly big fan of MMOs. I've sorta kinda went through the ringer on all kinds of MMOs trying to find things that I like playing, but uniquely, Final Fantasy XIV doesn't necessarily do anything different starting out, it just gets everything right, which is, I guess, all they needed to do for me. If you're anything like me, you might feel pretty indifferent to MMOs in general, but I mean, Final Fantasy XIV is pretty cool. As I'm currently making this video, free trial players can play up to level 60, having access to all the expansions aside from the very recent one that they currently made. And historically speaking, the free trial players will only get their level cap increased, not quickly mind you, but it does eventually go up. And the newest expansion will eventually become free too. It's kind of hard to equate how long a playtime is if it's only equated to levels in an RPG, but from what I can tell, level 60 is a pretty long ways away from me still. So I mean, you get a lot of game for playing for completely free.
Great. And we're lost. Hello?
Alright, so I know what some of y'all are already saying. Man, what is Backrooms Games doing on here? Some sort of weird Unity asset flip, something or other, blah blah blah. And look, I do get it, right? But I wouldn't be putting a game on here if I didn't think it was worth your time. Escape the Backrooms is a good, fun multiplayer romp set in the internet's favorite liminal space environment. Or least favorite, depending on who you ask. Gameplay in Escape the Backrooms basically involves you going through the levels of the Backrooms. They're literally categorized as levels, and this works in a gameplay sense too. Each level is going to basically have you going through some sort of objective and completing it in order to progress to the next one.
Get in. That was too close.
And any given mechanic in any of the levels isn't going to remain consistent. There's always something new to look forward to here. The nature of the game itself is very big on basically surprising you. It's like you're given some sort of item and it's like, oh cool, you know, whatever, what does this do? And the initial opening whenever you get to a new level is kind of cool too, because it's like, you know, sometimes the environments are weirdly pretty. It's kind of hard to talk about, right? Because like, I don't want to show off everything the game has to offer because it would kind of spoil you of the surprise.
Go, go.
And I really do think a big part of this game is the discovery aspect, coming across a new level, seeing a new environment, and what that particular level offers in terms of mechanics and stuff like that. This is going to go into the surprisingly competent camp, because if you've seen other Backrooms games before, it might not immediately give off that impression, because, you know, most just aren't. But yeah, I don't know, I just think it's worth a look. Right, so you might notice that I'm not doing a full title card this time, and that's because of a couple different reasons. Monster Hunter is a game series that has had its main sort of gameplay loop pretty consistent throughout the entire series. And sort of as a result of this, it's hard to recommend just any one game. Basically any of them work. You have Monster Hunter World or Monster Hunter Rise, which are the newest ones right now. Monster Hunter Wilds is going to come out at some point soon. We don't really have a release date yet, but I mean, it's supposedly soon. And then if you want to, you can even go backwards and emulate some stuff if you wanna. That has its own issues, obviously, but there's a ton of fan servers all over the place for all kinds of Monster Hunter games. The main gameplay loop of Monster Hunter basically involves hunting monsters, as the name would imply. It's gonna basically feel like a boss rush only video game. But every enemy is super unique and varied in what they're capable of. Similarly speaking, your hunter is also quite unique in whatever they're capable of. You have any number of different weapons to basically choose your kind of playstyle. You got things like defensive options, or ranged options, or in-your-face options, big single-hit stuff, tiny DPS stuff, and every weapon feels super distinct from one another. There's even sort of like a resource management angle too. Your inventory basically can host different tools that'll help you in your hunts. Some tools are only effective on some kinds of monsters. And there's a lot of build variety in all of these games too. All of the armor in any of the games basically has skills that, when paired together, can help define what your build looks like. And yeah, as a blanket statement for basically all of the games, it's nice to know that all of those individual mechanics are consistent. But each game also brings sort of its own unique spin on whatever mechanics already exist. Obviously, they also introduce some of their own mechanics and stuff too. like the wire bug system in Monster Hunter Rise. And while all of this is great, I do have to also mention that if you don't feel like paying for a full price game right now, then like I said before, you have the option of emulation. But if that's just proving to be too much or too annoying, or you just don't feel like it, then maybe just wait for Monster Hunter Wilds to come out. That is, of course, hoping that it's good, but we'll see. Alright, so we got another roguelike for the list. I actually don't know why this one is called Gunfire Reborn. There's only one game in the series. Anyway, Gunfire Reborn is a first-person roguelite. Like any roguelite, you pick your character, which will largely determine your playstyle, and along the way, completing levels will give you upgrades to accent your abilities. Every character comes with an active ability and some sort of grenade-like throwable. Just as well, every character has preferences in how they want to play. Some characters can be ability-focused, or large weapon-focused, or melee-focused, or any number of things. And all this stuff is pretty standard for a roguelike, of course. But what makes Gunfire cool is, one, there's a lot of things to do in the game. There's a lot of options on a per-run basis of basically what you want to work on depending on unlocks and stuff. They even have like different game modes and stuff whenever you get done with your first traditional run. That, and then also, there's a lot of variety here in the game. Picking a character doesn't tie you to one playstyle necessarily. You can further define it however you want to, basically. Just as long as you find something you like. All of the weapons feel really unique and good to use. I had mentioned before in passing that this game is kind of scratching a Borderlands itch for me just in a roguelike setting. And looking on the wiki, apparently that is true. I don't know if that's quoted from anybody specifically, but if you wanted something like Borderlands to play, then you have it here in a short, condensed form, and it's pretty tightly designed. At the end of the day though, this is still a roguelite, so naturally if you're not inclined to that genre, then you're not really gonna like this game. But if you do like it, it's good chaotic fun. I will say the one weird hiccup with this game specifically is that basically this game is made by Chinese developers. And while the game does have an English translation, finally explaining mechanics of how some upgrades work or how some weapons work can get pretty weird and cluttered. Sometimes descriptions just don't make sense, and that's not exactly a good thing. If you're taking the time to look at it and parse the information, then it'll work, right? But at the same time, I don't know, it can kind of break the pacing a little bit if you're trying to go through a run and you're reading a wall of text and just kind of looking at it really confused like. I'm almost certain that there's some sort of fan patch or mod to make it to where the descriptions are a little bit more condensed or make just more sense. But I don't know, I haven't looked for it too hard. And at the same time, I haven't really felt like I needed to. Like, I don't know, it's fine. Kinda weird, but it's not a deal breaker or anything. But yeah, I don't know, I feel like a lot of people skipped over Gunfire Reborn and feel like that's kind of a shame, so maybe try it and play it if you seem interested. Right, so even though I'm mentioning just one game here, I do want to say that having Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks on here is going to act as basically a gateway into playing retro games. So, you know, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of ROMs. If you decide to go through the path of emulating something, specifically maybe something that you played during your childhood and you want to show your friend, this might be a good catch-all idea to come across something that you want to share with your friend that maybe you grew up with. This might lead into specific conversation pieces mid-playthrough of something like, oh, I remember what's coming up next, or man, I hate this part, here's why it sucks, and stuff like that. And I think that's a specifically important part about multiplayer games that, like, I don't know, people don't really think about too often, is the individual memories you make with your friends. And I personally think reliving those memories is a good way to go about it too. So yeah, anyway, the game. If you know about Mortal Kombat, then you know that primarily it's a fighting game franchise. The other spin-offs in this franchise have had varying levels of success, most of them being not very good. But specifically in regards to Shaolin Monks, this game kind of has its own cult following just because it's a multiplayer character action game. So it's something in the vein of like the OG God of Wars, or like DMC basically. You have combos and stuff that you do in an open environment in order to basically just string together attacks using the characters' like given moveset, stuff that they're known for and things like that. The really neat sort of fold in this dynamic though is that because it's a multiplayer game, You're not only allowed, but also incentivized to combo with the other player. Someone can perform a launcher and then follow up on that launcher, just as an example, but there's a whole bunch of other things you can do too. And because it's a Mortal Kombat game, fatalities are indeed a thing. They even spin the fatalities into a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'll save that for your actual playthrough of the game because I don't want to spoil those. They're cool on their own. You get sort of this unique look of the environments too. You can actually physically go through some iconic stages in the Mortal Kombat universe, but now you can actually run around and explore them somewhat. And with a dash of early 2000s nostalgia sprinkled all throughout the game, it can be a good time. I feel like another understated aspect of multiplayer games is the journey that players go through, and being able to experience that journey with another player or players. You get to have experiences and make memories with another person directly next to you, whether it be physically or digitally, and I don't know, that's just really cool. In respect to the emulation side of this discussion, like I said before, it can be kinda sorta like reliving your memories and showing them to somebody else in a physical, playable form, which makes this specific example kinda super unique. So even if you're not super down for whatever this game offers, like I said, it acts as a gateway to play something from your childhood or from earlier in your life and go through some of your old favorite games with a friend. And I think regardless of how you take this information, it might be a worthwhile avenue to explore. So this is gonna kinda seem like a weird mentioning just for the sake of it kinda thing. And partially speaking it is. Personally, I find having an FPS game to just pick up and play is kind of a good thing if you don't know what else to choose. Even better if it's multiplayer, which they typically are. It helps then that the finals is free. At least the gameplay is free, everything gameplay related is anyway. Customizations are tied to things like a battle pass and an in-game store. Like, there is a handful of things that you can unlock by just progressing through the game, but realistically speaking, if you want to customize your character, you have to shuffle for some actual money, which, you know, but at least you can play it just fine. The actual gameplay in the finals, when it comes to the moment-to-moment gunfights, is some standard FPS fare. However, the final spin on this formula is essentially tied to you being able to pick one of 3 classes. There's a light, medium, and a heavy class. They get different equipment and different abilities. Different weapons too. The gadgets and abilities specifically, in terms of their gameplay purpose, is going to feel more like a hero shooter, kinda sorta. So in this way, it's kind of like a customizable hero shooter FPS thingy. But yeah, I don't know, it's kinda cool, because you get the ability to pick what kind of gear pieces you want to further accent your playstyle, specifically. I feel like I've been saying that sentence a lot lately, but whatever. The game also gets relatively frequent updates. New content in the form of new mechanics or gear or weapons are also still free, and as far as I know, they're going to continue to be free. There's no pay-to-win stupidity here, thankfully. And if you play the finals only specifically for the gameplay, then it's only really a healthy thing, I think. Specific game modes in the finals are also pretty non-standard as well. I think sort of the flagship game mode in this game is the cash out mode. Essentially, eliminating enemy opponents in cash out will net you a small amount of points. The actual aim of the mode is to get a box, bring it to a cash out station, and basically have your team be under control of it whenever the timer reaches 0. Other teammates can rob the timer from you, and it doesn't restart the timer or anything. It's basically a mad dash to take control and defend the cash out box until the timer reaches 0. So of course, this means that coordinating with your team is a pretty important aspect as well. Alternatively, there's a free-for-all mode that works kind of like dog tags in Call of Duty or something. You pick up money and then you have to cash it out, and the more you pick up, the more you're worth. If you're the person running around with an awful lot of cash, then other players can start seeing you from the map and you get a pretty huge target on your back. That's not even mentioning that throughout the entirety of any of the modes, throughout the entire gameplay, there's actually like destructible level environments too. Like, most things in the game can actually be destroyed. If you're picking someone like the Heavy, for example, you can basically just barrel through walls and destroy whatever you want to get to an objective or make space for yourself. During any round of the finals, though, there's also these things called events, which basically influence the entire map in any number of ways. This can be things like a meteor shower randomly having meteors crash onto the environment, and they do break buildings and stuff, so more level geometry stuff happening. There's also like an orbital laser strike and an anti-gravity mode, or how about mega damage, which makes it to where it becomes incredibly easy to break any of the walls or buildings. And that's just like a couple of the events. There's a whole bunch of other ones, and I'm sure that as updates go on, they'll add more. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that's it for the finals. Even if you're not looking for anything to play multiplayer-wise, you can still play this one single-player if you just have nothing else better to do. I don't know. Why not? Give it a shot. Okay, so now that we've about reached the end of the video, I want to throw in some honorable mentions real quick. There's a large part of me that doesn't want to talk about Helldivers again, but that's kind of only just because I've been talking about it for the past 3 videos and I'm kind of over it. Talking about it anyway. The game is good. I don't have any issues with the game itself, but, you know, odds are you've already been playing it or you've heard about it before and you're not interested. But I figured include it anyway just so that, you know, if I didn't, somebody would probably get mad. In a similar vein, Lethal Company is a video game. Again, you've probably heard of it already, but pretty recently there was a new update for it, and here around the corner there's going to be another new update for it as well. If that doesn't specifically interest you, then there are a lot of mods for Lethal Company, and naturally mods can do all kinds of things. There's even a couple full conversions that change the objective of the game too, if you're looking for something newer but still similar. Leading into that, we also have Content Warning. It's a game that's very similar to Lethal Company but with a different objective and a different atmosphere, so that can be cool if you're interested. I also personally think that Minecraft is always a good pick, especially if you put mods in it. If you get the right mod pack on something like CurseForge, then it can end up changing how the entirety of the game works, and that might be exactly what you're looking for. You know, you just have to look for it first. One more weird throw-in I'll also put in is actually Halo the Master Chief Collection. If you or your friend is a fan of the Halo story, then it's worth it to go through the campaigns. Alternatively, you have the multiplayer modes for all the Halo games to go through, which can also be a good time. And finally, I'll just throw Warframe in here as well. I'm not going to necessarily explain anything super in-depth about Warframe here because, like, there's a lot happening with that game. Although, if you are interested in Warframe because it is free, then I would highly recommend looking at my previous video talking about Warframe and how to get into it. Because I do think a lot of the systems in that game specifically are kind of weirdly obtuse and super in-depth, and you kind of need someone to sort of show you the ropes in some way. But if you end up sticking with that game, there is a lot to look forward to there. And then just one little last itty-bitty thing before we wrap up. During the Shaolin Monks part of this video, I had mentioned that specifically when it comes to retro emulation of video games, that can be a good time from a slightly different angle, especially if they're games that are pretty hardly cemented in being multiplayer. The issue that I didn't necessarily highlight in that segment was that obviously there's no real easy way to just play a game like that in multiplayer. Obviously, some games in previous console generations made it to where it did have online servers, and a lot of those have been retroactively revived by some communities. But alternatively, whenever it comes to the multiplayer games that are couch co-op specifically, you might need to turn to something like Parsec or something, just some way to be able to have player 2 control your computer rig on the player 2 side of things. However you can go about getting that to work. I haven't necessarily looked into that specifically too much, because primarily I have an option to just play couch co-op games with somebody else anyway, so it's not a problem for me. But I understand it can be kind of obtuse for a lot of other people, and that's fair. I don't know. Look at Parsec or find some other method to make it work for you if you want to go through that angle. But yeah, I guess that's everything I wanted to mention for in terms of multiplayer game recommendations. I don't know, let me know if there's any games that you would personally like to recommend, and I may or may not turn this into a series of its own. That'd be kind of cool. I know that it's kind of been a minute since I uploaded anything, and that's just because work schedule has been kind of a nightmare lately, but hopefully things will get back to normal here soon. We'll get back to regularly Friday uploads here after this one's uploaded, so everything should be back to normal again. But yeah, let me know what y'all think. I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment if you have any other recommendations or anything like that. Y'all have a good one.